Hello and welcome. I'm Veronica Vargas Stidvent, Executive Director of the Center for Women in Law, and I want to welcome you to today's installment of the Susan Blount Power Lunch series. Today's discussion is with Kristen Silverberg, former ambassador to the United Nations. Our Power Lunch series showcases the career paths of prominent lawyers and public figures in an informal environment. Today's event has been approved for 1.25 hours of Ethics CLE credit by the State Bar of Texas. So if you're joining us here in person, we'll have forms for you with the course number on the way out. If you're joining us live via Zoom, you'll receive an email at the end of the program or later this afternoon with how to claim your credit. And if you're calling into Zoom, if you would let us know that you attended by sending an email to Center for Women in Law, that's all one word, at law.utexas.edu. So, and we'll also save some time today for some Q&A. So if you're in the audience, we'll have a roving mic. And if you're online, if you'll use the Q&A function to submit your questions, we'll make sure that we can see those as well. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, or maybe in a while, the Center for Women in Law is a national resource and champion for women lawyers, generating lasting change within the legal profession. And we pursue that mission in a variety of ways through a variety of programs, including our Power Lunch series. And our Power Lunch series is sponsored by our Hortense Ward Speakers Fund. And today's event is also sponsored by Kelly Klingeman Financial Planning. So thank you very much to our sponsors. We're very grateful for that support and for the ongoing support of so many of our donors, including those of you in the audience and online. We appreciate all your gifts, and every single gift makes a huge difference for the center. So without further ado, let's meet today's guest, Ambassador Kristen Silverberg. Ambassador Silverberg is President and COO at the Business Roundtable. Prior to BRT, she was a Managing Director at the Institute of International Finance. She served in the George W. Bush administration as U.S. Ambassador to the European Union from 2008 to 2009, and as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs from 2005 to 2008. She also held a number of senior positions at the White House, including Deputy Assistant to the President. Ambassador Silverberg served in 2003 in Baghdad, Iraq, for which she received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. She formerly practiced law at Williams & Connolly in Washington, D.C., and served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and Judge David Santel of the U.S. Court of Appeals. She attended Harvard College and the University of Texas School of Law, where she graduated with high honors. So we're very excited to welcome her back to the law school. Ambassador Silverberg also serves on the boards of Vorbeck Materials, the International Republican Institute, the Forum for American Leadership, and the Vandenberg Coalition. And she's also a member of the steering committee of the Reagan Institute Strategy Group. So please join me in welcoming back to Texas Law, Kristen Silverberg. So Kristen, we're really excited to have you back. And we have a lot of ground to cover because you've had such an exciting and varied career. From your bio, as people can see, you started with a very traditional path, law school, clerkships, big law, and then at some point you decided to take a detour and go in a different direction. So can you talk a little bit about making that decision, if it was a real conscious decision, if it was an opportunity, how did you make that plan?
Well, first, let me say how excited I am to be back at this institution, which has means so much to me, and with old friends and with my former White House colleague, Ronnie, so it's really great to be with you. As Ronnie was saying, I graduated from UT, that was in 1996. I moved to DC to clerk for a judge on the DC circuit, David Santel, with every expectation that I would come back to Texas that year to practice law. I had my heart set on going to Gibbs & Bruns, great litigation firm in Houston, and fully expected to sort of stay on that path. But partway through the year, I decided I really wanted to stay in Washington, that I really loved it there. And so I landed at Williams & Connolly, litigation firm in DC, practiced law for a couple of years, and then was hired by Justice Thomas to clerk on the Supreme Court, and that was October term 99. And as I was coming to the end of that clerkship, Governor Bush, my home state governor, was running for office, and so I had a choice. I could go back to a law firm that was super tempting at the time. The Supreme Court bonuses were outrageous. I mean, they've gotten more outrageous every year since. Or I could come back to Texas, move back in with my parents, volunteer on a campaign. And so anyway, I called, decided I was gonna call the campaign and see if I could come down. They called back to say, okay, well, somebody's gonna come interview you. It's this lawyer named Ted Cruz. He's gonna check you out. And anyway, Ted came up, and I guess I passed muster. So they said I could go down and volunteer. I stayed there for a few months, ended up at the Florida recount, and then was hired to go into the White House to work in the Chief of Staff office in one of two policy roles, a role that Ronnie later filled herself.
And so when you took that role, this is what I think is interesting about making that pivot, is the question of who's your client, right? So when you go into a policy role like that, especially as a lawyer, and they tell you right away, you're not practicing law, right? That's general counsel's office, that's White House counsel's office job. You don't need to do that. How do you figure out where you owe your obligation? I mean, who is your first duty to in a role where you're really thinking about policy, there's competing interests? Who do you owe that duty to?
Yeah, I mean, these issues have become a lot more complicated, or they seem a lot more complicated since. So I'll tell you what my general approach was, and then we can talk about where I think there are some issues. But to me, when you go work for a presidential administration, or you clerk for a federal judge, or you go to work for a member of Congress, you're working for somebody who has a designated constitutional role, and your job is to help them fulfill their role. So it's important to always keep in mind that your staff, and I think that's true whether you're a junior staffer for a member of Congress or whether you're Secretary of State. I think you have to remember that you're not the person who was confirmed by the Senate into an Article III role. You're not the person who was elected by the American public to fill in Article I or Article II function. You're the person who's there as staff, and an arm of your principal. And so your job isn't to pursue your kind of personal policy preferences. Your job is really to help your principal pursue his or her policy principles. So now that's complicated. This is, in what's hopefully a kind of rare circumstance. Sometimes a staffer could get put in the position of being asked to do something that's unlawful or unconstitutional, and obviously you can't do that. Your ultimate duty is to the Constitution or the laws, but your general, when you go in kind of day to day, every day, I think your attitude has to be, how am I going to help the president pursue his policies? And so I would not have taken a job if I didn't feel like I could do that, if I didn't feel like if I'd feel too much discomfort about a judge's or a president's policies or views. I think, my view would be you shouldn't accept the job.
And do you think, the instance that came to mind that we talked a little bit about before was the recent leaking of the Dobbs decision before it was ready to be issued. And you clerked for Justice Thomas, you clerked on the Federal Court of Appeals. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that duty. And you could see, like, when that happened, my first thought was someone didn't like the direction this was going and thought leaking it would create an outcry or change the outcome or do something, right? But I remember when it leaked, my husband and I were like, should we even read this opinion? Because it shouldn't be out here. As if you're an institutionalist and if you've ever clerked, you know that there's a special bond between clerks and their judges, and it's it becomes a little bit familial. So can you talk a little bit about that, and if you see a change in people thinking that their conscience trumps the institution in policy matters or in outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the leak was really atrocious and problematic, in part because there's a code of conduct that applies to law clerks, and in my experience, the people I clerked with and everyone I know, I think, really takes that seriously. And one of your duties is confidentiality. And I think it goes back to the point I was just making about what your real function is. I mean, there's no question, obviously don't know who leaked it or what their motivations were, but there's no question that the person was putting themselves in a position of being a kind of principal actor, that they didn't have a frame of mind. How can I help the court do its job and use its own judgment, and help the justices use their own judgment in as thoughtful and wise a way as possible. It was an attempt, one way or the other, to kind of sway the outcome. So to me, it was a major breach of trust. I do think there is more of a tendency in staffers generally in Washington to put themselves in that position. And when I was saying I think things have gotten more complicated, I think some of that is related to the Trump administration. And to me, there are kind of two issues that came up in the administration that complicated things. One is that the president we worked for was very decisive. There was a very kind of clear process for making a decision. The entire White House knew when you were taking a question to the president for his judgment. The arguments on all sides were clearly delineated. And when he made a decision, it was very clear he had made it, and everybody would have said, okay, time to go implement this thing. In the Trump administration, I think that was less clear. The president changed his mind a lot. The process wasn't as deliberate. There was a lot of kind of one-offs, one-off comments, or maybe venting to one staffer to get a different position with another staffer. And so I think it was hard for a Trump administration staffer to know the president has made a decision. So I think that's one part of it. And then two, there were some decisions that were decisions and directions that were clearly problematic legally and morally, January 6th being the most problematic.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% because I think process matters in policy. I mean, I have my own theory about the venue of the policy process matters, right? The room in the White House where things are decided matters. But understanding that in Washington, information is currency and power. And so putting aside, the Supreme Court example, what are your thoughts on how people use that power, that information? Does it matter if a staffer leaks something and thinking it's ultimately advancing, for example, the president's policy aims? Is there a different calculation about handling that information, those issues of confidentiality, that sort of leveraging of information in a policy setting, whether it's in the executive branch or the congressional branch as opposed to the judicial branch?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is leakers usually are trying to narrow the range of options in some way. They're trying to cabin the policy process or expose some difference of opinion on the other side or embarrass somebody who's taking a different position or kind of corner the process. So I guess there are some deliberate leaks. Sometimes administrations put out things as trial balloons or whatever, but if you take those out of the picture, if it's just an isolated staffer leaking, it's almost always inconsistent with the point of view I just described, which is you're there as a staffer to help your principal make decisions. So I think it's almost always the wrong thing to do. I think there are exceptions. I think in the case of unlawful behavior, I think that raises a bunch of other issues about whether you have to disclose, resign, create obstacles. So I think that's different. But generally in the policy process, when you're talking about different policy points of view, I think it's almost always a violation of of the duty you owe to your principal.
So let's talk about your experience in the White House, because I think, as you said, it's really special and unusual, right, to come in right into the White House from a campaign position. There's not many people who get to do that. And so to come in and you join the policy apparatus, you are really, really, and I don't know if people fully understand that you were really in the mix of things at a senior level from day one, essentially. And how did you navigate knowing, your role in that, And I remember, Andy Card had said, it's really important to understand the hierarchy and then understanding when you overrule that hierarchy. So how did you navigate that coming in? And there were people who had been working together for decades at that time, right, together, the people who really, really knew each other. How did you navigate that?
I don't think I did respect the hierarchy. I think I just wandered around the White House expressing my opinions liberally, as you know. But I was very lucky for a couple of reasons. One, I had a boss, as you know, Josh Bolton, who really empowered me and the other person who worked in his office. So I think, we had his confidence and Andy's. And the other thing is it really was a process in the White House that sort of invited respectful disagreement and debate. One story I've told before is very early on in the administration. So 2001, pre 9/11, I was sitting in the Roosevelt Room, which is talking about venues that matter, but is a room right next to the Oval Office where sometimes the White House holds senior discussions, and I was on the back row. All the senior staff were at the table debating something, and I had gone in very early that morning to edit the president's radio address. He was taping later that day. Anyway, all of a sudden the door closest to the Oval Office opens, and the president and our colleague Harriet Myers, a really amazing lawyer who had been staff secretary at the time, walk in. And anyway, the president is holding the radio address, and he tells everybody in the room, okay, I'm going to read this. Let me know what you think about this. And he read the original version, the one I'd edited. And everybody said, oh, that sounds fine, that looks great. And he looks over and said, she doesn't think so. And I was standing on the side, and my knees were shaking. And anyway, but I told him, well, Mr. President, respectfully, and whatever, defended my point of view. And he said, no, that's not what I said, that's not my policy. And I said, well, sir, and technically, and blah, 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 and defended it again. And anyway, he finally was like, okay, fine, what if I say X? And my boss, Josh Bolton, said, Mr. President, that's perfect, which was his way of telling me, like, you are done here. Anyway, it was just a really amazing experience because I, as a 30-year-old, kind of debated the president and survived.
Yeah,
So,
in a room full of advisors. I mean,
Yeah.
that's hard to do. Did you feel like your legal training gave you an edge? I mean, you had non-legal positions in the White House, and really, largely since then, right? And so you weren't really offering legal advice, but how much of your legal training and education did you bring to bear on these discussions and things you did, like edit what the president's going to say?
A lot. I mean, a big part of the policy process is you have to, understand how to read a statute, understand what Congress is trying to do to amend it or change it, or read a draft regulation. So some of it is just that you can kind of consume a legal document and understand it. And some of it is just the rigor of law school, that you learn how to be analytical and methodical and to break down a problem. There's that exercise one of my professors did early on in law school, which some of you may remember, where he had somebody say, okay, you read this case last night, what happened in the case? And somebody would raise their hand and say, there was a guy with a blue shirt who was driving a red car down the street 30 miles an hour. And the professor would say, does the blue shirt matter? Does the red car matter? No, and kind of winnow down to the facts of the case that actually were relevant. And that's a big part of the policy process, is like break down the problem. What are the things in this problem that really matter, that really are going to make a difference? And so anyway, I think the rigor of the legal training undoubtedly helped shape my approach to policy.
One thing that I remember to this day about talking with you when I was about to step into the role that you had really defined was when you explained that a lot of the job was sharing information, which is different, right, than what you may be trained to do as a lawyer. It's not about sharing information. And it was this idea, I think it might have been Josh's screensaver, like,
Yes.
who needs to know? And to keep that in mind every day. So can you talk about that, maybe that mental pivot of an obligation to withhold information and to keep it close, to the idea that your obligation is to really share information and think about who, and it's not who wants to know, right? But who really needs to know.
Yeah, it was Josh's screensaver, and I keep that in mind all the time because I think, you know, in a lot of jobs, that's a big challenge is kind of the sharing of information and making sure everybody's working in the same direction. In every White House decision, there was kind of a network of people, like a evolving, you know, the Office of Management and Budget where you worked would be involved, or the National Economic Council, or the White House lawyers, the people in legislative affairs, the people from the agency. And there was all kind of a group approach to almost every major decision. And so actually making sure everybody had the relevant information to make a good decision was a big part of it. And there's something about every place I've ever worked, every process that prevents that from happening. And I don't know if it's people protecting information because it's currency and they like to have it, or if there's just people get busy and they don't think about information sharing, but it's just a big part of the job. So anyway, I always try to keep in mind Josh's screensaver and think about that as I approach my positions.
And you had a unique perspective too, because as I think you described it as sort of a roving player, right? You were actually roving around the policy process, seeing maybe where those information deserts were, and trying to help that along. And then was always interesting to me is that you chose to go to Iraq. And so I think people would love to hear, like, and for people who may not have been around at that point in our nation's history, that was not a great time to be visiting Baghdad, right? And you decided to go and serve our country. Can you talk a little bit about that? What motivated your decision and some of the challenges you faced to make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I really cared about national security issues, particularly after 9/11, but throughout my career, and it was clear this was going to be the biggest foreign policy, national security challenge the U.S. was going to face, that if we were going into Iraq, that was going to be an enormously challenging long-term effort. And so part of it is I just thought that would be really interesting, and and I want to be there to see it, and it was. I mean, everything about it. It's such an occupation is a really bizarre thing to see. People going about their business, and U.S. tanks rolling down streets, and the kind of political process in Iraq of trying to build the country out of war into kind of a functioning, accountable government. That was all fascinating. So anyway, it was just part of a sense of, that I thought this was a really important thing we were attempting. And
yeah, I mean, and it was. What's interesting to me too is that since then a lot of your career has been focused on foreign policy and national security, but up until that point it was really domestic policy. You did a lot of work on Patients' Bill of Rights, on all these things that were also really important competing interests. How did you, or maybe you didn't, prepare yourself for those things? I mean, those are the types of things that maybe in law school you saw yourself working on, or maybe you didn't see yourself working on.
On foreign policy, or
on any of that? I mean, like, were you in your second year of law school saying, I really want to work on domestic public policy issues or foreign policy issues?
Yeah, no, and I mean, the bottom line is I was not prepared. I mean, I spent the first couple of years of the White House asking really stupid questions and probably these are bad suggestions. So no, I didn't feel prepared. As I said, I felt intellectually prepared, in part because of law school, but I didn't feel like I had expertise or knowledge, and I still don't. I mean, 20 years later, I feel like the policy landscape is so broad and the issues are so complicated that every topic, including the ones I work on now, in some ways feel like, they feel brand new all the time.
Yeah, and then you came back and you ended up at the State Department. So we talked about how you have an obligation and duty to advance your principles, views, and objectives and mission. So you go from the White House to an agency, which is a totally different animal, making that transition. So can you talk about how that changes your relationship with the White House, how that changes the relationship, how you feel like who your first obligation is to, and how that changes your advocacy?
Yeah, I had, when Secretary Rice was moving from the National Security Council over to the State Department, I had asked if I could go along. There were a few different jobs open, but the one I landed in was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. So I was sort of attached to the person who was our then Perm Rep in New York, John Bolton, and our other UN ambassadors, and the big focus was on Security Council resolutions on issues like Iran, a lot of issues around UN reform, and things like that. So all entirely brand new. There's a huge bureau that's attached to it, so there were subject matter experts on everything who could do briefings, but most of it was pretty new. I felt like I had a huge advantage because I'd come from the White House, so I had a really good sense of how the White House was likely to approach particular issues. Secretary Rice was a very strong Secretary of State, entirely, fully empowered by the president, and so I never had to worry about a gap between her and the White House. She really had kind of discretion to make decisions, and so anyway, that made it easier. But it was definitely a steep learning curve.
And you mentioned how you felt free to give your opinions around, and I know you don't shy away from a debate or an argument.
No.
Did you ever lose an argument and have trouble accepting that policy decision and moving forward on it?
I lost a lot of arguments, so no question about it. But I really didn't have a lot of trouble accepting it, partly because our process was so deliberate and clear. There were very few times in the administration where a decision was made and I didn't understand the arguments on the other side, or I didn't see how the decision was made. I always felt like I had a fair shot at it, and that makes a huge difference in kind of, keeping everybody on the same page as making them feel like the process is transparent and fair.
And understanding that process, I would think that there would be another temptation, which is, and the book Engler talked about Vice President Cheney and how his understanding the process allowed him to have a lot of advantages in terms of the flow of information, understanding where things might pop up. Did you ever feel like you had a little bit of an unfair advantage or maybe a larger advantage understanding the process from multiple angles? Being able to understand this is exactly who is going to see this in the White House, or this is exactly how this is going to work at the agency, and being able to meld those together. Did that work for you? Was that too much temptation for you? How did you handle that?
It usually did, because by the time I was at the State Department, I had, obviously I'd worked with so many people who were still at the White House, and if there was an issue I felt very strongly about, I could call back and talk to whoever it was. And that happened a lot of times when I got to Brussels as ambassador. I was having a big debate. Well, I had a couple of debates with some of the agencies, but I had worked, by then my White House colleagues were deputy secretaries, so I could call them and have the conversation directly. But you're right that, to the Cheney point, there's no question that that understanding the bureaucracy is a big part of succeeding in the administration, and knowing what leverage you can pull and who you can talk to and where the decision is being made is a huge advantage.
Would you ever want to go back in to government?
I would. I feel like I was so spoiled last time around. I could not have, ever. I feel like my bosses were all great, people I admired and trust. I, had enormous respect for President Bush. My jobs were interesting, and felt like I had kind of privileged positions. So anyway, it'd be really hard to replicate that, but those jobs are so rewarding in terms of feeling like you can just make a difference, that the things you're working on every day are relevant to the American people. And so I absolutely would do it, if there was a president I really had confidence in, someone who I felt like I could serve in the way I described earlier, that I could really, vigorously, advance their policies, then absolutely I'd want to do that.
And what was your thinking when you left your position as Assistant Secretary of State and to become Ambassador to the UN, which is a huge honor? How did that come about? And then two, what was your thinking about it?
The person who had been ambassador to the EU was a recess appointment, had not been Senate confirmed, and so there was this bizarre circumstance where the job was opening up at the very end of the administration, and so they had, anyway, the White House had called to say that, asked if I was interested and say that I could be nominated, but there wasn't really a high expectation that I'd get confirmed because it was the end of the administration and because Democrats held the Senate at the time. Actually, Joe Biden was the chairman of the committee at that point, and so the expectation was that they would just say, no, we're going to leave the job open and leave a career person as an acting until the next administration. But as it turns out, I had kind of friendship and had worked with the person who was staff director at the time, who was Tony Blinken. And anyway, the State Department Legislative Affairs team said, we're going to take you up to meet with the Democratic staffers, and you should just know this is going to be a very unhappy process. You're going to get grilled. They're going to question you for hours, and then you probably won't get confirmed. But you got to go through this. Anyway, so I went up to go, give my, ounce of blood, and walked in, and there were a bunch of Democratic staffers sitting around the table, and I walked in to, sit down and do it, and Tony walked in from the side and said, oh, Kristen, we really got to get this process done. We need you over in Brussels right away. And I could see all the staffers like they just lost their victim. So anyway, so miraculously I got through, and then had the just final year in the Brussels.
Which is in and of itself must have been an incredible, amazing, and strange experience to be over there. And I think I misspoke and said UN to the EU, ambassador to the EU. And were you prepared for that? And what was and how did you feel about, I think we talked a little bit about this, what your role was? Again, who your client is, what's your role, who you owe your obligation to as you're sort of parachuted in over there to represent the country.
Substantively, I felt prepared at that point, because at that point I had been in the other State Department role for a few years, so I felt like I knew the subject matter, and I knew the way the State Department worked. So in a sense, I felt prepared. But the role of ambassador is a very unusual one, because you're sent abroad with a letter from the president saying that you're his, representative, and in theory, you are supposed to have sort of total control over, everything that the U.S. government does in your jurisdiction. So in practice, it doesn't always work that way. There's lots of cooks in the kitchen, and so anyway, it's a very, very hard job. And then on top of it, it's complicated because there's two kinds of ambassadors. There are career foreign service officers who serve, for example, in a dangerous post, will almost always have an ambassador who's a career person. They're expert diplomats. They speak multiple languages. They've spent many years working their way up the ranks of the State Department, highly skilled diplomats. And then there are political appointees who are usually appointed because of a relationship with the president. They're typically people who've had, great success in some area, so they may not know as much about the substance, but they have skills. They have usually some emotional intelligence and lots of, they're pretty persuasive, skilled people. And I was somewhere in between. I was a political appointee, had a little bit of substance, but not as much as a career foreign service officer. Anyway, so to me, it was about trying to find the way to do the job in a way that makes sense to me, which in my case meant kind of focusing on some of the policy issues that I cared most about.
So looking back at your career, in government? Is there a place you would have stayed longer? Is a place you would have left sooner? Some place you wish you had gone? Is there something you would have done differently if you had the chance to do your government stint again?
I would have really liked more time in the Brussels post because it's hard. I feel like it takes you a couple years to get good at a job. So I didn't really feel like I ever mastered that one for sure. So I think that's where you'd
spend some time. I found an article you wrote for the Texas Law Alumni Magazine. I
Yeah.
did, but it was great
Yeah.
because it was about really encouraging people to pursue, especially lawyers, pursue a career in public service and government and think about that. And one of the sentences, I found this so charming because it was, I thought, very modest of you when you talked about, I know that sometime later in life, I will confidently face down a corporate executive or court of appeals judge, knowing that I cut my teeth in a much more intimidating environment. And so I thought about you now, as you've gone back in the private sector, now you're COO of the Business Roundtable, and how many CEOs and corporate executives you must visit with all the time. And I don't think you need to grow into it. I mean, you were doing this, as you said, you're debating with the president early on. So making that transition, what were the skills that helped you make that transition to executive roles in the private sector? And what advice would you give to people as they're thinking about how a career in government can help them later?
I think a lot of it was training and decision making. So I got to watch some really skilled decision makers tee up decisions, and I think I learned a lot about that, about kind of how you frame questions, how you frame disagreement. So anyway, I think that's clearly been helpful, and that comes up at Business Roundtable all the time. We have to make a decision. We're trying to outline policies for how the U.S. government has tax policy that's fiscally responsible, but that allows companies to compete around the world, or an approach to China that helps us address our national security concerns, but that also lets companies do business with China on non-sensitive issues, those kinds of things. And so sort of how you frame your choices, I think that has been really interesting. And one interesting thing about government service, one reflection I always had, is that the choices usually didn't come down to facts or something. I mean, hopefully your decisions are sort of informed by data and research, but that usually wasn't the deciding factor. It was almost always a values question. So you have, on either side of a policy question, you have some cost or some risk, and you have to choose which one you're willing, to face. That's sometimes a generational question. Do you want to do something that will be good for the U.S. economy in the short term, but that's going to pose a cost for future generations, or could be certainly true around environmental policy and other things. And so I think that training and how you articulate the value you're trying to serve, I think that has also been really useful.
And in your role as at BRT, you were heading policy there, and now you're president and COO. Has that been a significant change for you? Do you feel like your role is still navigating and trying to build consensus around policy? I mean, how is that different from what you were doing before?
It's a lot of similar topics, but with a broader approach. We develop policies, we also advocate for them. So we spend a lot of time with policymakers, with members of Congress, or administration officials, arguing the points, and that's been a bigger part of the role. And then all the issues around managing a big team. Which also, by the way, was a big part of my training in government. There's a sense sometimes in the private sector that government management is less serious in some way, that your management training, really has to come from the private sector. But actually managing a team in government can be really challenging. One, you normally don't fire people. That's very hard to do. And in fact, in lots of cases, you can't even move them to another job. And so you spend a lot of time, and you have limited incentives. You're not, it's not the private sector where you give somebody a bonus for good work. You basically, give them a pat on the back and then hand them some more work. So I thought my government management jobs were great at helping me be more creative about all the different tools you have to, to motivate people or help give them confidence or, steer them in the right direction. And anyway, that's a big part of this BRT role.
And I don't know if you ran into, speaking about your management experience, I don't know how much of this you ran into at State, but there is sometimes this big tension between career staff and political staff. And you talked about how your role as a political appointee is to advance the president's mission. A lot of times the career staff at agencies feel like their role is exactly the opposite, to maintain the status quo or hold the line until the next political team comes in. So did you have to deal with that at all, or was that not an issue as much at the State Department?
It thankfully wasn't a huge issue. I mean, I thought vast majority of people at the State Department, I think, wanted strong leadership, certainly respected Secretary Rice and her judgments. And so I thought most people, I think, could be persuaded to, okay, let's all move in this direction. That's not, obviously, it's not 100% true. And, it's a huge challenge. But but it goes back to part of this training is how do you persuade a skeptical audience, this is the direction we need to go in, here's your role in kind of helping us move in this direction, and really motivate them to put some energy behind something that wasn't their original instinct. And I think that's a part of every management job.
Yeah. I want to make sure we're saving time for questions, but I did want to ask you to address, as some of our careful readers of your bio may notice that there's some gap years in there, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. When I got married at the very end of the Bush administration, I was 38 when the president left office, and so I stayed home to have kids. I didn't have a lot of runway at that point, so I was really focused on doing that. And then I stayed home when the boys were little. I did some kind of part-time projects. I was involved in a human rights project at the Bush Institute in Dallas and did some other things, but mostly was just home with the boys. And then I went back to work in 2013 on a very interesting but very family-friendly role, and didn't really go into a kind of full-time role until I moved to Business Roundtable in 2019.
Well, that's an issue that's obviously come up and really been highlighted in the pandemic, this idea of how do we balance all the competing interests in our own lives, right? Not just at work. And so do you have advice for people wanting to take some time for whatever it is that they're pursuing and then come back into pursuing their career again? I mean, you've it hasn't hurt your career at all, but do you have some thoughts about that?
I don't know if it hurt or not. I mean, it was absolutely the right decision for me, but it's hard to kind of game out what the other alternatives were. But a journalist who had taken 5 years off from her career and then gone back told me at the time, it'll be fine. Like, it just, that's what you want to do, just do it. And that was generally my kind of attitude. I mean, that's one of the, until 2019, I really didn't have to think about work-life balance because I was either in the administration, single and childless, or I was staying home with my kids, or I was in a very family-friendly role. And so it really is only the recent years that I've had to kind of manage a more complicated balance. But my own just advice, for when I talk to younger people is that if what you want to do is pass up a job because it's not a great fit for kind of your family life, that's fine. Like, you don't have to feel like you're, letting down your gender or not leaning in or anything else. So you kind of have to do the thing that's going to work for you and for your family.
Hi. Thank you. Could you speak to the question of U.S.-China and, for example, TikTok? And Governor Abbott has directed the university to, end support on Wi-Fi for TikTok for students, faculty, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is by far the toughest, most challenging, and maybe not TikTok, but generally the nature of the U.S.-China relationship is the most difficult, challenging, and probably important issue that DC policymakers are confronting now. And just to kind of grossly oversimplify the problem, for decades, the U.S. has had an approach to kind of national security issues that there's a very narrow set of tools we use to regulate a kind of economic, regulate national security risks in an economic relationship that were mostly designed to make sure we didn't inadvertently send a adversary materials for weapons of mass destruction, or we didn't inadvertently facilitate the advancement of a foreign military. And that question, how, our willingness to intervene in an economic relationship is changing in the China relationship because there's a much broader set of concerns. And I think the way that most DC policymakers would put it is there's a concern that China will use its leverage against the US, its leverage economically, or it's the reliance of the US in terms of our reliance on China for some important supply chains around pharmaceuticals or electronics or other things, or would use its leverage in terms of a tool like TikTok to gather data on on U.S. people, that there's a much broader set of concerns than the traditional national security issues around the military or WMD. So anyway, there's a whole very early stage and not particularly sophisticated debate happening right now about where do you draw the line? What's the line between a real national security issue and just kind of an over intervention? And what are the limiting factors? So it can't be the case that sort of everything that helps China is subject to regulation. So how does a policymaker draw that smart line? I think we're going to be dealing with this question, the line between kind of national security and, and issues that aren't sensitive for decades. So anyway, that's to say on TikTok in particular, I don't really have a view. I mean, BRT hasn't got involved in that question, so I don't really have a particular view. But I think this question of the hazards of a Chinese company having access to too much data, U.S. consumer data, without the kind of protections around data privacy we're used to, I think that's going to be a issue.
Thank you. Welcome former Texas Secretary of State, Ruth Hughes. Thanks for joining us.
So much for sitting quietly in the audience. I wanted to thank you for sharing your story, both the professional but also the personal. It doesn't get talked about enough, so I really appreciate that you create this forum to have those discussions for women in particular and women lawyers. But I was curious too, just on the social issues that are surrounding our country and some of these binary choices on the companies are having to make in terms of what state they're operating in and what those social related policies are that impact their employees, impact their company, and ultimately their bottom line. You have such a who's who of businesses on your board. So how do you balance that when you're advocating so that you're kind of walking that line between like ESG, for example? It almost feels like you're going to end up in a situation where companies are either doing business in New York and California or in Florida and Texas. And so I'm just kind of curious on the national side and addressing some of those policy issues, how you marry all of those different interests for your members.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's not the outcome, because I think that would be really bad for the U.S. economy. In my view, just going back to this question about China, the strength of the U.S. corporate sector, the fact that we have companies that can compete around the world, that can go toe-to-toe with Chinese competitors in any region, that's a huge part of the U.S. strength. That our strong economy is a big part of the gravitational pull we have on other countries. So anyway, I hope that the outcome of this is not kind of states using corporations as kind of pawns in broader cultural debates. But I think it's also important for companies to be thoughtful about that, so not to not to approach these issues with some reflection. And the way we do that at BRT is to think about, we only want to be involved in issues where we have some credibility and expertise. I can't say we always do that, but we try very hard to speak out on issues where we really feel like we have something to add. And that's clear, though, clearly issues around the US economy, but sometimes issues about, things that affect employees, but mostly we try to speak on areas where we have credibility. Two is we try to speak about issues when we think our voice would make a difference. So some of these issues are so divisive and partisan that there isn't anything BRT could say that could make a difference. There are some areas where there is room for common ground, and so we really are drawn to those places where we think, there's room to agree. And so anyway, I think that's where this is headed. I think companies are all kind of reflecting what's their role on weighing in on kind of some of these broader social debates. And I think to the extent they do it, it'll, I think, increasingly be in areas where they feel like they have some expertise and where they feel like there's room for common ground.
I do have a few online questions.
Okay.
What is your favorite policy that you've ever worked on?
Golly, that is really hard. There's one that, there are a lot of options. There's one that comes to mind recently because we're about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR, which was President Bush's program on HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa. And it's just been an enormously successful program that has saved millions of lives, literally. And I liked that process a lot because it wasn't obvious that, I don't think anybody would have predicted that the Bush administration would go into that issue in such a, kind of extraordinary way. It was an issue where this values question really was important. There was a huge cost to it, but President Bush also felt like we were writing off lots of lives, that people were, suffering from a disease that was treatable, and so there was something the U.S. could do about it, and we ought to do it, and we were pretty rigorous about it. I mean, there was a lot of evaluating metrics and results and progress and best practices, so I feel like it was kind of government at its best in that sense.
Great. And do you have advice for law students who are intrigued by the possibility of a policy career in government as to what classes and experiences they should seek out?
Yes, you should go talk to Heather Way, who's in the back there, particularly if you're interested in housing policy. There are a lot of different paths to a policy career. I got there, as I mentioned, by volunteering on a presidential campaign. There's a woman, Carmel Martin, who's President Biden's domestic policy advisor, who worked at a think tank and at DOJ. Rami Ratliff worked at the Treasury Department. Dean Chesney has gotten involved in policy through his writings and his service on lots of advisory boards. So I think there are a lot of paths there. And one thing you could do is go talk to Rami and ask who are some alums who are involved in this space and get connected with them.
Then another question is, could you briefly describe a typical case discussion with Justice Thomas?
Yes. The justice would hold clerk conferences. So every justice pretty much had 4 clerks. And anyway, me and my 3 co-clerks would go into the justice's chambers. Usually there was a clerk who was assigned the lead on a particular case. And so that person would play the biggest role in kind of developing, a set of recommendations. And then we would just debate it for kind of as long as it took. And anyway, we'd go kind of back and forth about, original understanding of the constitutional provision, of what the case law said, of what the parties had argued in the briefs, of whether there was some interesting amicus brief that had a angle. inevitably, in Justice Thomas's case, we would talk for a couple hours and then end up talking about Nebraska football, which is a great passion of his. He has an awesome sense of humor, so there was always like lots of joking around. Anyway, and then we would go off the clerking is interesting because you get a really good window into how the court decides, but you aren't in the room for the actual decision. You don't. Nobody is in the room for the justices' conferences except the justices, and so anyway, they would come out of those conferences and tell you. The justice would tell you what the outcome was and who was writing the opinion, and then you'd sort of go to work with the other law clerks to try to come up with something. If you were on the majority, you'd try to come up with a draft opinion that could keep a workable majority. But anyway, that was a great experience.
Last question from online. Please describe your actual work day on 9/11. What did your day look like, and what were your duties?
So I showed up at sometime early that morning, and I remember seeing on TV, I can't remember the circumstances, whether somebody came into the office and said, turn on the TV, or I don't remember, but I remember seeing the images of the first plane hitting, which I think must, after the fact, and I remember a big disconnect after the second plane hit. My brain went through every, the second plane must have followed the first plane. I mean, I did these huge mental gymnastics before I sort of caught on to what everybody else understood, which, that this was an act of terrorism. So I remember just a very foggy period. We were taken down to the White House mess. The building next door, the Eisenhower Executive Office building, was kind of cleared out right away, but they took the West Wing staff down to the White House mess, and I think we were still there when the Pentagon was hit, and then they decided to vacate everybody, but by the time we left, it was total ghost town outside. I mean, and I think there were some helicopters overhead, but it was, but basically nobody was around, and we all ended up at an office building nearby, basically waiting for instructions for most of the day. There were speechwriters there who were in sort of talking to some of the senior staff, Karen Hughes, who was the head of communications, about, what people should say, and so we were helping them for a bit. And then that evening, some really large armed guys showed up and basically walked us back into the West Wing. I think there were, maybe half a dozen of us at that point, and we basically started thinking about what the next day was going to look like. And for us, on the domestic and economic policy side, so not, the national security had its own challenge, but for us, it was about basically all the, the next kind of 3 months were about all of the things. What are the legal authorities we have but don't need? What does a financial, war on terrorism look like? So what do we need in terms of getting at the resources? How do you deal with all the horrible consequences in New York? There's a shortage of morgues at one point, and I remember, kind of how do we deal with that? There was all the issues around the Victims' Compensation Fund, around the environmental issues at 9/11. The stock market, as you recall, was shut down at the beginning. How do you get that set back up? Anyway, it was just, months of kind of wading through all these, wading through the tragedy and trying to, help the country come out of it. And in particular, by helping people think of a way that they could be helpful. And there was a lot of work about inspiring volunteering and civic action, and finding ways for people to contribute to kind of helping the country heal.
Maybe a good wrap-up question. It was really nice to hear your story and your experiences. I'm curious how you define success for yourself.
Wow, okay. That is super hard. I really want a job that feels rewarding and like I'm making a difference. So like lots of people, I want to feel like that I could point to something, contributing to helping solve some problem. So success would be really being able to point to, I played a role in this thing that I feel, made a positive difference. Success has, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I read this really interesting book called How Women Rise, which basically says that all of the things that get you to your first stage of success are not the things that help you get to the next stage. And so one of the challenges I've had in my career is that I've defined success in the way that lots of, type A lawyers do, which is attention to detail and, whatever, carefully crafted sentences and crossed T's and dotted I's. And one of the real challenges of this stage of my career is you have to step back from a lot of that sort of over perfectionism or attention to detail actually can be a distraction from the kind of bigger, more ambitious things you want to do. And so anyway, I think part of success is keeping your eye on the big picture, on really where you're trying to head, rather than on getting stuck in your inbox and focusing on the kind of minor thing that's, that's on your plate. So anyway, a big part of success for me is kind of, was this a day where I kept my eye on the bigger picture and figure out where I'm trying to lead Business Roundtable or this particular policy issue.
Thank you.
One of the questions I have for you is you've worked with incredible people throughout your whole career, and I was just wondering, when you're looking back, if you think about the role of mentorship and sponsorship in your career and how that influences how you interact with the next generation of leadership, and if that has influenced you, and if you want to name names, you can, but what has changed about your career and your life because of that mentorship?
When I was much younger, I was really unapologetic about calling and asking people if they would spend time with me. I mean, I remember as a college student asking Kay Bailey Hutchinson if she would meet with me, which she did. And, there's something about, when I was in college, Harvard hosts this event for newly elected members of Congress, and I remember contacting one of them, Chet Edwards, who was a congressman from Waco, to say, there's a group of Texas students who want to take you and some of the other members of Congress to dinner. Would you like to go? And they said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And then I went and found some Texas students to go. So anyway, so I was really I really did not hesitate at all to ask people for advice or suggestions. As it turns out, I've had amazing mentors, and most of the ones who I think have played the biggest role are people who I worked for. So there were people who I really was in the trenches with and spending lots of time with. Those are the people I think who spent the most time. So actually the randomly looking for mentorship did not pan out as well as the actual show up every day and work hard for somebody. And I've been very selective about, my bosses. I've always put thought into who I was going to work for. I always looked for people who I could trust, who I thought had high ethical standards, who were well respected, people who, my boss, Josh Bolton, who's my current boss, I really, widely respected, very smart, ambitious in terms of wanting to do good and important things. And so anyway, I've always tried to look for bosses who I could kind of trust in that way, and who also had my best interests at heart.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think it's a testament to the people who you've worked for twice too. That's the seal of approval from Kristen Silverberg. So
For sure.
So Kristen, I want to thank you for coming back to Texas Law to visit with us today. Thank you for being part of the Center's Power Lunch series. And please join me in thanking Kristen Silverberg. And thanks to everyone who joined us online. As I mentioned before, the event has been approved for 1.25 hours of CLE ethics credit, and you will get an email today about how to claim that credit. If you're joining by phone, please send an email to Center for Women in Law at law.utexas.edu to make sure that we get you that information as well. I thank you so much, and I hope you will join us for future events. Thanks, everyone.